Imagine you are 6 years old. You live in an orphanage. You have no parents to speak for you, no family to advocate for you, no one who comes on weekends and takes you home. The adults in this building are the entirety of your world. And when one of them tells you that something is wrong with you, you have no frame of reference for disbelief. No one to go home to and say, "The lady at school said something strange today, what do you think?" You just absorb it, the way children absorb everything, completely, without defense, without filter. Now imagine that the adult telling you something is wrong with you is not a teacher or a caretaker. She is a graduate student from the university. She comes regularly. She listens to you speak. And each time she shakes her head. She interrupts you. She tells you to stop. She says, "You are a stutterer. You have a very serious problem. You need to be very careful when you talk. Don't speak unless you can do it right. You do not stutter. You have never stuttered. But you are 6 years old, and an adult with a clipboard and a university affiliation has just told you, repeatedly, that you do, that there is something wrong with the way you speak, that your voice is broken. What happens to a child who is told that? The University of Iowa found out in 1939, and then they hid the answer for over 60 years. Welcome back to the darkest experiments. Last time we sat with the story of little Albert, a 9-month-old infant conditioned to fear the world, then sent home with those fears intact and no plan to remove them. We talked about what it means to treat a child's trust as a research resource, about the fears that get installed before we are old enough to understand them. Today, the children are older, old enough to talk, old enough to feel embarrassed, old enough to know with painful clarity when something about them has been identified as wrong, and they are precisely targeted for that reason. Because the experiment requires children who can be spoken to, judged, and watched for a particular kind of damage. The experiment has a name that its own researcher gave it in private with a dark kind of self-awareness. He called it the monster study. The year is 1939. Wendell Johnson is a speech pathologist and researcher at the University of Iowa, and he is also himself a stutterer. He has spent years developing a theory about the origins of stuttering, and it is a theory that runs directly against the prevailing wisdom of the time. Most researchers of the era believed that stuttering was neurological, something in the brain, something inherited, something fundamentally organic. Johnson disagreed. He believed with deep personal conviction that stuttering was socially induced, that it began not in the child's brain, but in the ear of an anxious parent, a parent who labeled normal childhood disfluency as stuttering, made the child self-conscious about it, and thereby created the very condition they feared. His theory was called diagnosogenic, meaning the diagnosis itself causes the disorder. The label creates the reality. It was a compelling theory. It was arguably, in some respects, a compassionate one, because if stuttering was socially constructed, it could potentially be socially prevented. If parents simply stopped labeling normal speech bumps as stuttering, the theory went, fewer children would develop the condition. To prove the theory, Johnson designed a study. His graduate student Mary Tudor would carry it out, and the subjects would be children at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home. Children without parents, without advocates, without anyone outside the institution to protect them. Tudor selected 22 children from the orphanage. They ranged in age from 5 to 15. Some of them had genuine stutters. Most did not. They were divided into 4 groups. Group 1A, children who stuttered, given positive therapy, told their speech was normal, encouraged, praised. Group 1B, children who stuttered, given negative therapy, told their stuttering was serious, that they should stop speaking if they could not do it perfectly. Group 2A, children who did not stutter, given positive therapy, told their speech was fine and they should feel confident. Group 2B, children who did not stutter, given negative therapy, told they showed signs of stuttering, that they needed to be careful, that they should not speak unless they could do so perfectly. It is Group 2B that represents the beating heart of the experiment. These were fluent children, children with no speech disorder whatsoever, who were systematically told by an authority figure they had no reason to distrust, that something was wrong with the way they spoke. Tudor visited the orphanage regularly over several months. In each session with the Group 2B children, she delivered the same message in different forms. You have a problem. Your speech is not right. You need to be careful. Stop talking if you are not sure you can do it properly. She also instructed the orphanage staff to echo the message, to comment on the children's speech, to express concern, to reinforce the idea that these particular children had a condition that required monitoring and caution. What happened next was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was devastatingly clear. The previously fluent children in Group 2B began to change. They became quiet, withdrawn, self-conscious. Some began to hesitate before speaking, to slow down, to repeat syllables, the exact behaviors that characterize a developing stutter. Some stopped volunteering answers in class. Some stopped speaking at group meals. One child, who had been described before the experiment as confident and talkative, was documented afterward as barely speaking at all. Children who had entered the study with no speech disorder left it with one, not because of any neurological event, because an adult had told them, repeatedly and authoritatively, that their voice was broken. When Tudor completed the study and reviewed her results, she was troubled. In her thesis and in letters to Johnson, she expressed concern about what had happened to the Group 2B children. She described returning to the orphanage after the formal experiment concluded and attempting, informally, to reassure the children, to tell them their speech was fine, that there was nothing wrong with them. It was not enough. The damage had been done with the sustained, repeated authority of months of negative conditioning. It could not be undone in a few gentle sessions. Johnson recognized immediately that the study could not be published. In 1939, the ethics of experimentation on children were not governed by the formal review boards and consent requirements that exist today. But even by the standards of the time, deliberately inducing a disorder in healthy orphaned children was something Johnson understood would be professionally catastrophic if it became public. He filed the thesis away. He never published the findings. He never sought to treat the children who had been harmed. The monster study, a name Johnson used privately, with a gallows humor that speaks to some awareness of what had been done, stayed buried for over 60 years. In 2001, a journalist named Jim Dyer published an investigation into the study in the San Jose Mercury News. The story broke into national consciousness like a stone through a window. The University of Iowa issued a formal apology to the surviving subjects, several of whom had already died, carrying their altered speech and their unexplained self-consciousness with them to the end. Lawsuits followed. In 2007, the state of Iowa settled with 6 surviving subjects for a total of $925,000. The settlement was not an admission of liability, but it was a recognition that something had been done that required acknowledgement and restitution. What the money could not give back was what had been taken. Several of the subjects described, in interviews, a lifelong relationship with speech marked by shame, hesitation, and the quiet belief that something about the way they talked was not right. They had never known why. They had been children in an orphanage in 1939, and a woman from the university had come and told them they had a problem, and they had believed her because that is what children do. They believed the adults. Some of them spent their entire adult lives speaking carefully, guardedly, holding something back. Not because their brains worked that way, but because Wendell Johnson had a theory to prove and they were available. Here is one of the most painful ironies embedded in the monster study. Johnson's diagnosogenic theory, the theory that parental labeling creates stuttering, was never definitively proven by this study or any other. The evidence that stuttering has significant neurological and genetic components has grown substantially in the decades since. The theory that a parent's anxious label is the primary cause of the disorder is now largely discredited. The children in Group 2B were harmed in the service of a theory that turned out to be wrong. And the Group 1A children, the stutterers who were given positive, encouraging therapy, did show some improvement, which is among the few genuinely constructive findings in the entire study. The lesson that positive reinforcement and the removal of shame can improve speech outcomes in children who stutter is a real and valuable one. It is, unfortunately, buried beneath the weight of everything else the study represents. The monster study is a story about the power of labels. We have visited this territory before, in the Rosenhan experiment, where psychiatric labels rewrote the perception of sane adults. Here the labels rewrite the behavior of children. Children who trusted, who had no defenses, who took the word of adults as the word of reality itself. This has implications that extend far beyond speech pathology. Think about every child who was told by a teacher or a parent or a doctor or a coach that they were not smart, not athletic, not musical, not good at numbers, not a leader. Think about how many of those children adjusted their behavior to fit the label, How many stopped trying, stopped speaking up, stopped raising their hand? Not because the label was accurate, but because the authority behind it was convincing. Labels are not neutral. They are instructions. They tell the person wearing them how to understand themselves, and they tell the people around them how to treat them. And when a label is wrong, when it describes not a reality but a projection, a theory, an assumption, the person wearing it pays the cost. The children in Group 2B did nothing to deserve what happened to them. They spoke normally. They were simply unlucky enough to be available and unprotected enough to be used. Their story is a standing reminder of what is at stake when power meets vulnerability, and of the responsibility carried by every adult who holds authority over a child's sense of self. What you tell a child about who they are is not a small thing. It may be one of the largest things you ever do. The monster study was hidden for 60 years. The children it harmed grew up without knowing why they felt the way they felt about their own voices. The researcher who conducted it expressed private remorse but chose professional survival over accountability. And the institution that enabled it issued an apology 6 decades too late to survivors who had already lived their whole lives with a wound they couldn't name. That is what happens when science loses its moral compass. Not a dramatic explosion, not a public scandal caught in real time. Just a quiet filing away of a thesis, a door gently closed, and a group of orphaned children walking back to their dormitories carrying something new that no one will explain to them. Next time, we close Chapter 3 with the experiment that many researchers consider the longest-running and most systematically harmful study on vulnerable children in American history. It took place not in a university laboratory, but in a state institution on Staten Island, a place called Willowbrook, where children with intellectual disabilities were deliberately infected with hepatitis virus year after year for nearly 15 years. That story is coming in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave a comment below. The conversation in this community matters. And thank you for having the courage to keep watching. I'll see you in the next one.